My son hit me when I refused to sell our house to pay his gambling debts. What I did after that. The mark on my cheek was still red when I made the phone call that would change everything. After 68 years on this earth, I never thought my own flesh and blood would raise a hand to me. But sometimes the people we love the most can hurt us in ways we never imagined possible. Chapter 1. The Storm Before the Calm. My name is Dorothy Washington, and if you had told me 5 years ago that I'd be sitting in my kitchen at 2 a.m., ice pack pressed against my swollen cheek, dialing 911 on my own son, I would have called you a liar. But here I was, trembling fingers hovering over those 3 numbers, wondering how everything went so terribly wrong. The house was eerily quiet now. Marcus had stormed out 20 minutes ago, slamming the front door so hard that my grandmother's china rattled in the cabinet. The same china that had survived the Great Depression, World War II, and 40 years of family gatherings. It had survived everything except my son's gambling addiction. Let me back up and tell you how we got here, because this story didn't start with violence. It started with love. A mother's love that maybe went too far, protected too much, and enabled too long. Marcus was my miracle baby. After 3 miscarriages and years of trying, he came into this world weighing barely 5 pounds, fighting for every breath. The doctors weren't sure he'd make it through his first week, but Marcus was a fighter then, just like his daddy had been before the cancer took him when Marcus was only 12. Maybe that's where I went wrong. When Robert died, I threw myself into being both mother and father to Marcus. I worked double shifts at the hospital. I was a registered nurse for 42 years, just to keep food on the table and clothes on his back. When he wanted new sneakers, I found a way. When he needed money for school trips, I picked up extra shifts. When he got into trouble, I bailed him out. Looking back now, I can see the pattern. But when you're in the thick of raising a child alone, you don't see the forest for the trees. You just do what you think is best, what feels like love in the moment. Marcus was smart, brilliant even. He could have been anything he wanted, doctor, lawyer, engineer. But somewhere along the way, he discovered that quick money felt better than hard work. It started small. A lottery ticket here, a scratch-off there. Then it was the office pools at work. Before I knew it, he was spending entire weekends at the riverboat casinos. Chapter 2. The Warning Signs I Chose to Ignore. The first real red flag came 3 years ago when Marcus asked to borrow $5,000. He was 35 then, working as a computer technician, making decent money. But he looked desperate when he asked, like a man who hadn't slept in days. "What do you need it for, baby?" I asked, already reaching for my purse. That's the thing about being a mother. Your instinct is always to help first, ask questions later. "It's for a business opportunity, Mama. This guy at work, he's got this sure thing. Just need some seed money to get started." I should have pressed harder, should have asked more questions, should have said no. But when your child looks at you with those same eyes that used to beg for bedtime stories, you want to believe. You want to be the solution to their problems, not another obstacle in their way. I wrote him the check. 2 months later, he was back. This time it was $10,000. Car repairs, he said. The transmission had gone out, and he needed reliable transportation for work. The lie came so easily to his lips that I almost believed it myself. Almost. But I'd raised this boy. I knew when he was telling tales, his left eye would twitch just a little, and he'd touch his nose. Same tells he'd had since he was 7 years old, trying to convince me he hadn't broken my favorite lamp. Still, I gave him the money. Because what's $10,000 compared to your child's well-being? What's money compared to keeping your family together? That's what I told myself anyway. The truth was messier, more complicated. The truth was that I was scared. Scared that if I said no, I'd lose him. Scared that he'd disappear from my life the way his father had disappeared into that hospital bed, getting smaller and weaker until there was nothing left but memories and regret. So I enabled him, fed his addiction with my retirement savings, my emergency fund, my peace of mind. Every time he asked, every time he promised it would be the last time, I believed him because believing was easier than facing the truth. The truth was that my son was sick, and I didn't know how to help him. Chapter 3: The House That Love Built. This house has been in our family for 47 years. Robert and I bought it in 1977 with a VA loan and more hope than sense. It was a fixer-upper then. Peeling paint, creaky floors, windows that didn't quite shut right. But it was ours. We spent our first decade together making it into a home. Robert would come back from his shift at the steel mill, tired and covered in grime, and we'd work on one room at a time, refinishing floors on weekends, painting walls by lamplight, installing new fixtures with the help of library books and stubborn determination. Every room tells a story. The kitchen, where I taught Marcus to crack eggs without getting shells in the bowl. The living room, where we watched him take his first steps, arms outstretched toward his daddy's voice. The basement, where Robert built a workshop, dreaming of the day he'd retire and make furniture for our grandchildren. After Robert died, this house became my sanctuary. It held our memories, our dreams, our entire life together. When the grief threatened to swallow me whole, I could touch the banister he'd installed and feel his hands guiding mine. I could stand in the garden he'd planted and smell the roses that still bloomed every June, faithful as sunrise. Marcus grew up here. This house witnessed his first words, his graduation from high school, his first heartbreak. These walls absorbed his laughter, his teenage angst, his dreams of making it big in the world. When he moved out at 22, full of confidence and ambition, I kept his room exactly as he'd left it. Just in case he needed to come home. He'd been coming home more and more lately. At first, it was just for dinner on Sundays. Then it was weekends when his apartment felt too lonely. Then it was longer stretches when work got stressful or bills got tight. I never minded. A mother's house should always be a refuge for her children, no matter how old they get. But over the past year, something had changed. Marcus wasn't coming home for comfort anymore. He was coming home because he had nowhere else to go. Chapter 4: The Point of No Return. The conversation that changed everything happened on a Tuesday evening in November. I was in the kitchen making Marcus's favorite meal, fried chicken, mashed potatoes, and green beans, the way his grandmama used to make them. He'd been staying with me for 2 weeks. Claiming his apartment was being fumigated, but I'd driven by there the weekend before and seen the eviction notice taped to the door. I didn't confront him about it, didn't see the point. Marcus was going through something, and my job was to love him through it, not pile on more shame when he was already carrying so much. He came into the kitchen while I was setting the table, and I could tell immediately that something was different. His energy was frantic, desperate in a way that made my stomach clench with worry. "Mama, we need to talk." I set down the plates and turned to face him. In the evening light filtering through the kitchen window, he looked so much like his father that it took my breath away. Same strong jaw, same deep-set eyes, same way of running his hand through his hair when he was nervous. "What's on your mind, baby?" He started pacing then, wearing a groove in the linoleum that Robert and I had installed 20 years ago, back and forth, like a caged animal looking for escape. "I'm in trouble, Mama. Real trouble this time." My heart sank, but I kept my voice steady. What kind of trouble? The kind that gets people hurt if they don't pay up. The words hung in the air between us like smoke, acrid and choking. I'd suspected for months that his gambling had gotten out of hand, but this was the first time he'd admitted it out loud. "How much?" "Marcus." He stopped pacing and looked at me with eyes that held more pain than any 38-year-old should carry. $87,000! The number hit me like a physical blow. I had to grip the back of a chair to keep from falling. $87,000, more than I made in 2 years as a nurse, more than most people see in their entire savings accounts. Oh, Marcus, oh, baby, what have you done? I can fix this, Mama. I can make it right, but I need your help. I already knew where this was going, but I had to hear him say it, had to make sure I understood exactly what he was asking of me. What kind of help? He took a deep breath, squared his shoulders like he was preparing for battle. I need you to sell the house. Chapter 5, The Line I Wouldn't Cross. The silence that followed stretched between us like a canyon. Somewhere in the distance I could hear the neighbor's dog barking, the evening news playing on a television down the street, the ordinary sounds of a world that suddenly felt completely foreign to me. Sell the house, I repeated, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. Just temporarily, Mama, just until I can get back on my feet. We could rent a nice apartment somewhere, maybe closer to downtown. It might even be better for you. Less maintenance, no more worrying about the roof or the furnace or... Marcus. My voice cut through his rambling like a knife. This is our home. I know that. But this is where your father and I built our life together. This is where you took your first steps. This is where your grandparents came for Christmas dinner every year until they passed. This house isn't just an investment, baby. It's our family's legacy. He stopped pacing and turned to face me fully. The desperation in his eyes was like looking into a deep, dark well. Mama, please, these aren't the kind of people you walk away from. They've already made it clear what happens if I don't pay up. Last week they sent someone to my job. Just to talk, they said, but the message was clear enough. Fear crept up my spine like ice water. What kind of message? The kind that involves hospitals if I don't come up with their money soon. I sank into the kitchen chair, suddenly feeling every one of my 68 years. How had we gotten here? How had my beautiful, brilliant boy gotten himself mixed up with dangerous people? How had I failed him so completely? There has to be another way, I said finally. What about bankruptcy? Or negotiating a payment plan or... Mama, you don't understand. These people don't care about payment plans. They don't care about bankruptcy. They care about getting their money, and they care about making examples out of people who try to stiff them. Then maybe it's time to call the police. Marcus laughed, but there was no humor in it. And tell them what? That I borrowed money from some guys and now I can't pay it back? They'll tell me it's a civil matter and send me on my way. Meanwhile, I'll be looking over my shoulder for the rest of my life, however long that turns out to be. I could see the logic in what he was saying, but I couldn't accept the solution he was proposing. This house was more than just property to me. It was the foundation of everything I held dear, the last tangible connection I had to the life Robert and I had built together. I can't, Marcus. I'm sorry, baby, but I can't sell this house. There has to be another way. The change that came over his face was immediate and terrifying. The desperation transformed into something harder, colder. Something I'd never seen in my son's eyes before. Another way? His voice was rising now, taking on an edge that made me instinctively lean back in my chair. What other way, Mama? You want me to rob a bank? You want me to turn tricks on the corner? What other way is there for someone like me to come up with that kind of money? Marcus, lower your voice. We can figure this out together, but not if you're going to... Going to what? Going to act like my life is on the line? Because it is, Mama. It literally is. He started pacing again, more aggressively this time, his movements sharp and erratic. I could see his father's temper in him now, the same flash of anger that Robert used to get when he felt cornered or helpless. You know what I think? Marcus continued, his voice getting louder with each word. I think you care more about this damn house than you do about your own son. I think you'd rather see me end up in a ditch somewhere than part with your precious memories. The accusation hit me like a slap. That is not true, and you know it. I have given you everything I have, Marcus. Everything. My savings, my retirement fund, my peace of mind. I have bailed you out more times than I can count, and I have never, not once, made you feel guilty about it. But this is different, right? This is where you draw the line? Yes, I said quietly. This is where I draw the line. What happened next will haunt me for the rest of my life. Chapter 6. When Love Becomes Violence. Marcus stopped pacing. The sudden stillness was somehow more frightening than his agitation had been. He turned to look at me, and for a moment I didn't recognize the person staring back. "You selfish old woman," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You're willing to let me die for a house." "Marcus, that's not—" "Shut up." The words came out like a gunshot. "Just shut up with your excuses and your platitudes and your fake concern. If you cared about me, if you really cared, you'd do this. You'd help me." I stood up from the chair, some deep instinct telling me I needed to be on my feet. "I do care about you. I love you more than my own life, and that's exactly why I can't keep enabling this addiction. You need help, baby. Real help. Not just money to throw at the problem until it goes away. Don't you dare lecture me about addiction." He was moving toward me now, and something primal in my brain was screaming danger. "Don't you dare stand there in your perfect little house with your perfect little memories and tell me what I need. Marcus, please, you're scaring me." "Good. Maybe you should be scared. Maybe then you'd understand how serious this is." He was close enough now that I could smell the desperation on him, see the wild look in his eyes that reminded me of cornered animals I'd seen in nature documentaries. This wasn't my son anymore. This was addiction wearing his face, speaking with his voice, but driven by something dark and desperate that I didn't recognize. "I'm not selling the house, Marcus. I'm sorry, but I won't do it." That's when he hit me. It wasn't a slap. It was a closed fist punch that caught me square on the left cheek and sent me stumbling backward into the kitchen counter. The pain was immediate and shocking, but the emotional impact was worse. In 68 years of life, no one had ever struck me in anger. Not my father, despite his drinking. Not Robert, despite our worst fights. Not even strangers in moments of road rage or crowded stores. But my own son, my miracle baby, my pride and joy, the person I loved most in this world, had just hit me. I touched my cheek, feeling the heat already spreading across my skin, and looked at Marcus in complete disbelief. He was staring at his own hand like it belonged to someone else, shock and horror warring with the anger in his expression. "Mama, get out!" The words came out quietly, but with more authority than I'd ever used with him before. They seemed to surprise us both. "Mama, I didn't mean to—" I said, "Get out!" Louder this time, my voice carrying the weight of 4 decades of dealing with difficult patients, drunk visitors, and emergency situations that required immediate action. "Get out of my house right now!" "But Mama, now!" He flinched like I'd slapped him back. For a moment, he looked like the little boy who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms, seeking comfort and protection. But then the moment passed, and the stranger was back. "Fine," he said, his voice cold as winter. "Fine. But when they find my body floating in the river next week, remember that this was your choice. Remember that you valued bricks and mortar more than flesh and blood." He turned and walked out of the kitchen. I heard his footsteps in the hallway, heard him grabbing his jacket from the coat closet, heard the front door open and slam shut with enough force to rattle the windows. Then there was silence. Chapter 7. The Call That Changed Everything. I stood in my kitchen for a long time after Marcus left, ice pack pressed against my swollen cheek, trying to process what had just happened. The rational part of my mind knew I needed to call someone, a friend, a family member, maybe even the police. But the mother in me was paralyzed by the magnitude of what had just occurred. My son had hit me. The child I'd nursed through pneumonia and broken bones, the teenager I'd waited up for on countless nights, the young man I'd cheered for at graduation, that same person had struck me in anger and then walked out of my life with threats and accusations. I kept replaying the moment, wondering if there was something I could have said differently, some way I could have de-escalated the situation. Maybe if I'd been dreading this conversation, but Mrs. Henderson had been nothing but kind to me over the years. She deserved some version of the truth. My son has been struggling with some personal issues, I said carefully. Things got out of hand the other night, and I had to call for help. Mrs. Henderson nodded knowingly. At 72, she'd seen her share of family drama. Her own grandson had spent time in rehab for drug addiction a few years back. Sometimes the hardest thing about loving someone is knowing when to step back and let them face their consequences, she said softly. I learned that the hard way with Tommy. Her understanding meant more to me than I could express. I'd been so worried about judgment from my community, about people thinking I was a bad mother or a vindictive woman. But Mrs. Henderson's response reminded me that most people have dealt with family addiction in one form or another. Most people understand that love sometimes requires difficult choices. Pastor Williams from my church called later that week. Someone had mentioned seeing police at my house, and he wanted to check on my welfare. I'd been attending Mount Olive Baptist for 15 years, ever since Robert and I moved to the neighborhood, and Pastor Williams had officiated at Robert's funeral. Sister Washington, I hope you know that you have a whole congregation praying for you and Marcus, he said during his visit. Whatever's going on between you two, remember that God can heal any relationship if both parties are willing to do the work. I appreciated his faith and his intention, but I wasn't sure I believed him anymore. Some relationships might be too damaged to repair, some trust too thoroughly broken to rebuild, but I kept those doubts to myself and thanked him for his prayers. The hardest conversation came from Marcus's ex-girlfriend, Jennifer. She called on Friday evening, her voice shaky with tears and confusion. Mrs. Washington, I heard about what happened. I can't believe Marcus would ever... he stayed here a few nights last week, and he seemed upset, but I never thought... Jennifer had dated Marcus for 3 years, and I'd always hoped they might get married someday. She was a sweet girl, a teacher at the local elementary school with a kind heart and infinite patience. But Marcus's gambling had destroyed their relationship just like it had damaged every other good thing in his life. He's not the same person you fell in love with, Jennifer, I told her gently. Addiction changes people in ways we don't always recognize until it's too late. But there has to be something we can do, some way to help him. He can't just keep spiraling like this. Honey, we can't help someone who doesn't want to be helped. And right now, Marcus is more interested in finding money to gamble with than in getting treatment for his addiction. Jennifer was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was thick with grief. I loved him so much, Mrs. Washington. I thought we were going to have a life together. I thought we'd give you grandchildren and have Sunday dinners at your house and grow old together. But the gambling, it was like watching someone disappear in front of your eyes. I knew exactly what she meant. The Marcus who'd hit me wasn't the son I'd raised or the man Jennifer had fallen in love with. He was a shadow of those people, driven by desperation and consumed by an addiction that had slowly devoured everything good about him. Chapter 12. The Trial Preparation. Marcus's court date was set for 6 weeks after his arrest. During that time, the district attorney's office contacted me several times to discuss the case and prepare me for testimony. The prosecutor, a sharp woman named Sarah Chen, explained that domestic violence cases involving adult children and elderly parents were becoming more common as addiction rates increased. The challenge we often face, she said during our meeting, is that victims sometimes change their minds about pressing charges. They feel guilty or hope that the arrest will be enough of a wake-up call to motivate change. I won't be changing my mind, I told her firmly. What Marcus did was wrong, and he needs to face the consequences. I'm glad to hear that, Mrs. Washington, but I want you to be prepared for the possibility that his defense attorney will try to paint you as an unforgiving mother who's abandoning her son in his time of need. They might argue that he was desperate and not thinking clearly, that he's never been violent before, that he deserves a second chance. I'd already thought about all of those arguments, had wrestled with them during sleepless nights and long conversations with Dr. Thompson. The truth was that part of me did feel unforgiving and harsh. Part of me wondered if I was being too rigid, too unwilling to consider the extenuating circumstances of Marcus's desperation. But then I'd look in the mirror and see the fading bruise on my cheek, or I'd remember the cold fury in his eyes when he demanded that I sell my house, and I'd know that consequences were exactly what he needed. "Let them paint me however they want," I said. "I know who I am and I know why I'm doing this." Ms. Chen smiled. "That's exactly the attitude we need. Now let's talk about what you can expect during the trial." The preparation process was thorough and sometimes emotionally difficult. We went over my testimony multiple times, discussing how to present the facts clearly without getting emotional or defensive. Ms. Chen taught me techniques for staying calm under cross-examination, for handling aggressive questioning without losing my composure. "Remember," she said, "you're not on trial here. You're the victim of a crime. You don't have to justify your decision not to sell your house or explain why you haven't bailed Marcus out of every problem he's created. You just have to tell the truth about what happened that night." During one of our sessions, she asked me a question that caught me off guard. "Mrs. Washington, what do you hope will happen to Marcus as a result of this trial?" I'd been so focused on the legal process that I hadn't really considered the bigger picture. What did I want to happen to my son? What outcome would serve justice while still holding space for the possibility of redemption? "I want him to get help," I said finally. "Real help, not just probation and community service. I want him to understand that his actions have consequences, and I want him to get treatment for his gambling addiction. I want him to become the man his father raised him to be." "And what about your relationship with him?" That was the harder question. "I don't know. I love him, but I don't trust him anymore. And I can't have a relationship with someone I don't trust, especially someone who's proven he's capable of violence when he doesn't get what he wants." Ms. Chen nodded thoughtfully. "That's honest, and honesty is going to serve you well in this process." Chapter 13. An Unexpected Visitor. 3 days before the trial was set to begin, I received a visitor I hadn't expected. Marcus's gambling counselor from the treatment program he'd supposedly been attending for the past 6 months. Dr. Michael Rodriguez was a soft-spoken man in his 40s who specialized in addiction counseling. He called first to ask if he could stop by, explaining that he'd been working with Marcus and wanted to discuss the situation with me. I was hesitant. The restraining order didn't prevent people from speaking to me on Marcus's behalf, but I wasn't sure I wanted to hear whatever message Dr. Rodriguez had come to deliver. "I'm not here to ask you to drop the charges," he assured me over the phone. "I'm here because I think there are some things you should know about Marcus's treatment and his current state of mind." Curiosity won out over caution, and I agreed to meet with him. Dr. Rodriguez arrived on a rainy Thursday afternoon carrying a folder of documents and wearing the kind of patient, understanding expression that I imagined he used with all his clients' families. "Mrs. Washington, first let me say how sorry I am about what happened between you and Marcus. What he did was completely unacceptable, regardless of his addiction or desperation." "Thank you. I appreciate that. I want you to know that Marcus has been attending our program regularly for the past 6 months, though his commitment has been inconsistent. He'll come to sessions for a few weeks, make real progress, and then disappear for a while when the work gets too difficult. This didn't surprise me. Marcus had always been someone who started things with enthusiasm but lost interest when they required sustained effort or uncomfortable self-examination. The truth is, Dr. Rodriguez continued, Marcus hasn't been fully honest with you about the extent of his gambling or his debts. The $87,000 he mentioned is only part of what he owes. Our assessment indicates that his total debt is closer to $130,000. The number hit me like a physical blow. $130,000. More than my house was worth. More than I would see in retirement savings. More than seemed possible for one person to lose gambling. How? I asked quietly. How does someone accumulate that kind of debt? It happens gradually, then all at once, Dr. Rodriguez explained. Marcus started with small bets, maybe $50 or $100 at a time. But gambling addiction is progressive. The amounts increase, the frequency increases, and when someone starts losing, they often double down trying to win back what they've lost. The people he owes money to, are they really as dangerous as he claims? Dr. Rodriguez's expression grew serious. Some of them, yes. Marcus has borrowed from multiple sources, some legitimate lending institutions, some private individuals, and at least one organization that we would classify as predatory. The threats against him are real, Mrs. Washington. I felt a familiar stab of worry and guilt. Despite everything that had happened, despite the assault and the restraining order and the upcoming trial, I still loved Marcus. The thought of him being hurt or killed because of his debts made my chest tight with anxiety. But, Dr. Rodriguez continued, that doesn't mean selling your house would have solved the problem. In our experience, when family members liquidate major assets to pay gambling debts, the addict typically sees it as permission to continue gambling. They think, well, if Mom sold her house to bail me out once, she must be willing to do whatever it takes to keep me safe. It becomes a new baseline for enabling rather than a final rescue. This was what I'd suspected but hadn't been able to articulate. Selling the house wouldn't have saved Marcus. It would have taught him that there were no limits to what I was willing to sacrifice for his addiction. What happens now? I asked. That depends on Marcus. If he's convicted, there's a good chance the judge will order him into a residential treatment program as part of his sentence. Sometimes legal consequences can provide the external motivation that people need to finally commit to recovery. And if he's not convicted, then he'll likely continue down the same path until something else forces him to change, or until the consequences become irreversible. Dr. Rodriguez left me with some literature about family members of addicts and a business card for a support group that met weekly at the community center. After he was gone, I sat in my living room reading about codependency and enabling behaviors, recognizing myself in nearly every description. I'd been a textbook enabler, motivated by love, but ultimately feeding the very addiction I was trying to help Marcus overcome. Every time I'd given him money, every time I'd believed his lies about why he needed help, every time I'd chosen peace over confrontation, I'd been inadvertently making his problem worse. The knowledge was both liberating and devastating. Liberating because it confirmed that my decision not to sell the house had been correct. Devastating because it meant that my efforts to help Marcus over the years had actually harmed him instead. Chapter 14. The Trial. The courthouse was smaller than I'd expected and less dramatic than what I'd seen on television. Marcus sat at the defendant's table with his court-appointed attorney, a young man who looked fresh out of law school. He didn't turn around when I entered the courtroom, but I could see the tension in his shoulders. The way he kept running his hands through his hair. The trial lasted 2 days. Ms. Chen presented the case methodically. My testimony about the assault, Officer Martinez's account of the crime scene, photographs of my injuries, medical records from my follow-up appointment with my doctor. The evidence was straightforward and undisputed. Marcus's attorney tried the defense strategy that Ms. Chen had predicted. He painted Marcus as a desperate man pushed to his breaking point, a son whose elderly mother had refused to help him in his time of greatest need. He emphasized Marcus's lack of prior violent offenses, his struggles with addiction, his remorse over what had happened. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," the defense attorney said in his closing argument, "this is a family tragedy, not a criminal case. Marcus Washington is not a hardened criminal or a violent predator. He's a sick man whose disease drove him to a moment of desperation that he deeply regrets." When it was my turn to testify, I tried to follow Ms. Chen's advice about staying calm and factual. I described the evening of the assault in detail, from Marcus's initial request to sell the house through the moment he struck me and stormed out. Under cross-examination, the defense attorney did exactly what Ms. Chen had warned me he would do. "Mrs. Washington, You say you love your son, is that correct? Yes, I do. And you've helped him financially many times over the years? Yes. In fact, you've given him thousands of dollars to help with various expenses, haven't you? Yes, I have. So when he came to you desperate, fearing for his life, asking for help one more time, you chose to protect your property instead of protecting your child. I took a deep breath before answering. I chose to stop enabling his addiction instead of feeding it with more money. But you were aware that refusing to help him could result in physical harm to your son? I was aware that continuing to bail him out of the consequences of his gambling would prevent him from getting the help he actually needs. The defense attorney pressed harder. Mrs. Washington, are you telling this jury that you care more about your house than you do about your son's life? Ms. Chen objected before I could answer, and the judge sustained the objection. But the question hung in the air anyway, and I could see some jury members looking at me with expressions that might have been judgment. In redirect, Ms. Chen gave me the opportunity to clarify my position. Mrs. Washington, can you explain to the jury why you refused to sell your house to pay Marcus's gambling debts? Because giving an addict money to pay gambling debts doesn't cure the addiction. It just makes it possible for them to gamble more. If I had sold my house, Marcus would have paid some of his debts and then continued gambling until he owed even more money to even more dangerous people. The only difference would be that I'd be homeless and he'd still be addicted. And how do you feel about your son now? I love him just as much as I always have. That's exactly why I couldn't keep enabling his self-destruction. Sometimes love means setting boundaries, even when those boundaries are painful for everyone involved. The jury deliberated for 3 hours before returning a verdict of guilty on the charge of domestic assault. Marcus showed no reaction when the verdict was read, but I saw his shoulders slump slightly, as if he'd been holding his breath and finally exhaled. Judge Patterson scheduled sentencing for 2 weeks later, ordering a pre-sentence investigation and recommending that Marcus be evaluated for substance abuse treatment programs. As we filed out of the courtroom, Marcus turned and looked at me directly for the first time since the trial began. His eyes were red with unshed tears, and for a moment I saw the little boy he used to be, the child who would run to me for comfort when he was hurt or scared. But then the moment passed, and he turned away without speaking. Chapter 15. Sentencing and Reflection. Marcus was sentenced to 6 months in county jail, followed by 2 years of probation and mandatory participation in a residential gambling addiction treatment program. Judge Patterson was firm but not unsympathetic in her remarks. Mr. Washington, you are clearly a man struggling with a serious addiction that has caused tremendous pain to the people who love you most. However, addiction does not excuse violence, and it certainly doesn't excuse assaulting your elderly mother when she refused to enable your destructive behavior. She looked directly at Marcus as she continued. Your mother's decision not to sell her house to pay your gambling debts may have been the most loving thing she could have done for you, even though I'm sure it was also one of the hardest. I hope you'll use your time in custody to reflect on that fact and to seriously commit to the treatment that will be required as part of your probation. Marcus accepted the sentence without comment. As the bailiff led him away, he glanced back at me one more time. This time, instead of anger or resentment, I saw something that might have been understanding in his expression. Or maybe that was just wishful thinking on my part. After the sentencing, Ms. Chen walked with me to the parking lot. How are you feeling? She asked. Relieved, I said honestly, and sad and hopeful, all at the same time. That's completely normal. You did a brave thing, Mrs. Washington. Most parents in your situation would have kept enabling their child's addiction rather than face the pain of setting boundaries. Marcus is lucky to have a mother who loves him enough to let him face the consequences of his actions. I thanked her and drove home to the quiet house where I'd lived for 47 years. Ruth had gone back to Atlanta the week before, after making sure I was emotionally prepared for the trial and its aftermath. I was alone again, but it was a different kind of alone than I'd felt in the weeks immediately following the assault. This was peaceful solitude rather than anxious isolation. I was alone by choice, not because I was afraid or heartbroken or overwhelmed by circumstances beyond my control. I was alone because I'd made difficult decisions that protected my well-being and hopefully created space for Marcus to find his way back to health. That evening, I called Dr. Thompson to schedule another appointment. The trial was over, but the work of healing and understanding was just beginning. "How do you feel about the outcome?" she asked during our conversation. "I think it was fair. Marcus needs treatment more than punishment, but he also needs to understand that his actions have consequences. Maybe this will provide the motivation he needs to finally commit to recovery. And what about you? What do you need going forward?" That was the question I'd been avoiding. For so long, my identity had been wrapped up in being Marcus's mother, his protector, his safety net. Without that role to play, who was I? What did I want my life to look like now? "I need to figure out how to be Dorothy Washington instead of just Marcus's mother," I said. "I need to remember who I was before his addiction consumed both of our lives." "That sounds like a worthwhile project. What did Dorothy Washington used to enjoy before gambling took over your family?" I had to think about that. It had been so long since I'd pursued interests or hobbies that weren't somehow related to Marcus's problems. Before Robert died, I'd enjoyed gardening, reading mystery novels, volunteering at the hospital where I worked. I'd been part of a book club, a quilting circle, a group of church ladies who met monthly for dinner and gossip. Somewhere along the way, I'd stopped doing all of those things, gradually giving up pieces of myself as I focused more and more on managing Marcus's crises and trying to solve his problems. "I used to have a garden," I said slowly. "Robert and I spent every spring planting vegetables and flowers. I haven't touched it since he died." "Maybe it's time to plant something new," Dr. Thompson suggested. Chapter 16. New Growth Spring came early that year, and for the first time in over a decade, I decided to resurrect the garden that Robert and I had created together. The raised beds were overgrown with weeds, the soil compacted and depleted, but the basic structure was still sound. I spent my first Saturday morning in March clearing away dead plants and pulling weeds, my hands remembering the rhythm of garden work, even after years of neglect. It was physical labor that required attention and care, but didn't demand complex emotional processing. For a few hours, I could simply focus on the immediate tasks of clearing, digging, and preparing. Mrs. Henderson came over while I was working, bringing a glass of sweet tea and staying to chat about plants and weather and all the ordinary things that had once filled my conversations before addiction took over my family's life. "It's good to see you out here again," she said, settling into the old lawn chair that Robert had placed beside the garden years ago. "You and Robert used to spend so much time out here together." "I stopped gardening after he died," I admitted. "It felt too lonely, I guess. Too connected to memories that hurt too much to revisit." "And now?" I considered the question as I worked compost into the soil of what would become my tomato bed. Now it feels like a way to honor those memories instead of avoiding them. Like I'm continuing something we started together instead of abandoning it. Over the following weeks, I threw myself into planning and planting with an enthusiasm I hadn't felt in years. I researched heirloom tomato varieties, planned companion plantings, designed a small herb garden near the kitchen window. I visited the local nursery multiple times, consulting with the staff about soil amendments and pest control and optimal planting times. The physical work was therapeutic, but so was the mental challenge of learning new techniques and trying different approaches. I'd forgotten how satisfying it could be to acquire knowledge for its own sake rather than as a means of solving someone else's problems. In early April, I received my first letter from Marcus. He was 3 months into his jail sentence and had begun participating in group therapy sessions for inmates with addiction issues. The letter was brief but sincere. "Dear Mama, I know I have no right to expect you to read this, but I'm hoping you'll give me a chance to say some things I should have said a long time ago. I'm sorry. Not just for hitting you, though I am deeply ashamed of that and will regret it for the rest of my life, but for everything that led up to that moment. I'm sorry for lying to you about my gambling. I'm sorry for taking advantage of your love and generosity. I'm sorry for putting you in danger by owing money to dangerous people. I'm sorry for asking you to sacrifice your home for my mistakes. The counselor here has helped me understand that I've been treating you like an ATM instead of like a person with your own needs and feelings. He's helped me see that every time you bailed me out, I learned that my actions didn't really have consequences as long as you were willing to clean up my messes. I don't expect you to forgive me, and I don't expect our relationship to go back to the way it was before. I know I broke something that can't be easily repaired, but I want you to know that I'm finally ready to do the work of getting better. Not because a judge ordered me to, and not because I'm hoping you'll give me money again, but because I can't keep living as the person I became. I hope you're doing well. I hope you're taking care of yourself for once, instead of taking care of me. Love, Marcus. I read the letter 3 times, looking for manipulation or hidden requests for help, but found none. It seemed genuinely focused on taking responsibility rather than shifting blame or asking for something. That was progress, though I knew better than to assume that one letter indicated complete change. I didn't write back immediately. Instead, I brought the letter to my next appointment with Dr. Thompson and talked through my complicated feelings about Marcus's apparent insight into his behavior. "It sounds like he's making progress," she observed. "How does that make you feel?" "Hopeful, but cautious," I said. "I've been disappointed before when Marcus seemed to be changing, only to find out that he was telling me what he thought I wanted to hear." That's a healthy response. Recovery is a process, not a single event. And it's common for people to have setbacks even when they're genuinely committed to change. The question is, what would you need to see from Marcus to begin trusting him again? I thought about that for a long time. What would it take for me to feel safe having a relationship with my son again? What evidence would I need that he'd truly changed? Sustained sobriety, I said eventually, not just from gambling, but from lying and manipulation and treating me like his personal bailout fund. I'd need to see him living independently, supporting himself, managing his own problems without expecting me to solve them for him. And how long would you need to see that pattern before you'd be willing to trust him again? Years, I said without hesitation. At least 2 years, maybe more. Long enough to be sure that the changes are real and permanent, not just temporary adjustments to get what he wants. Dr. Thompson nodded approvingly. That's a reasonable timeline, and it's good that you're thinking about this now, before Marcus is released and potentially pressuring you to resume contact before you're ready. Chapter 17. Growing Season. By May, my garden was thriving in ways that surprised even me. The tomato plants were already showing small green fruit, the herbs were lush and fragrant, and the flower beds were alive with color and buzzing with bees and butterflies. I joined a local gardening club and made friends with several other women who shared my interest in growing things. We exchanged seeds and advice, visited each other's gardens, and met monthly to discuss everything from soil pH to organic pest control methods. It felt wonderful to have conversations that weren't centered around crisis management or emotional trauma. These were discussions about beauty and growth, about patience and nurturing, about the satisfaction of creating something lovely and useful with your own hands. One evening in late May, I was watering the garden when my neighbor's grandson, a boy of about 10 named David, peered over the fence that separated our yards. "Mrs. Washington, your flowers are really pretty," he said shyly. "Thank you, David. Would you like to see them up close?" He nodded enthusiastically, and I opened the gate to let him into the garden. For the next hour, I found myself explaining the different plants, showing him how to identify ripe tomatoes, letting him help me harvest herbs for dinner. His genuine curiosity and excitement reminded me of Marcus at that age, back when the world was full of wonder instead of disappointment. "My mom says you used to be a nurse." David said as we picked cherry tomatoes. "Did you like helping sick people?" "I did," I told him. It felt good to know that my work made a difference in people's lives. "Do you miss it?" That was a question I hadn't really considered. I'd retired 5 years ago, partly because I was tired, and partly because I'd wanted to be more available to help Marcus with his problems. But now, with Marcus in jail and my time once again my own, I found myself thinking about the satisfaction I'd once felt in caring for patients and supporting their families through difficult times. "I miss some parts of it," I said honestly. "I miss feeling useful, and I miss the relationships I had with patients and their families." After David went home, I called the volunteer coordinator at the local hospital to ask about opportunities for retired nurses. It turned out they desperately needed volunteers for their patient visitation program, especially people with my background and experience. Within a week, I was back in a hospital environment for the first time since retirement, though now I was offering comfort and companionship instead of medical care. I visited with elderly patients who had few visitors, read to children in the pediatric ward, and provided emotional support to families dealing with serious diagnoses. It felt wonderful to be needed again, but in a healthy way this time. These were people who appreciated my presence without expecting me to solve all their problems or sacrifice my own well-being for their benefit. I could offer what I had to give without depleting myself in the process. Chapter 18, Unexpected Support. In June, I received a phone call that caught me completely off guard. It was Jennifer, Marcus's ex-girlfriend, asking if she could come by to talk. "I know this might be awkward," she said, "but I've been going to Al-Anon meetings, the support group for families of addicts, and I've learned some things that I think might be helpful for you to hear." I was curious enough to agree to the meeting, though I wasn't sure what Jennifer could tell me that I didn't already know or hadn't already learned from Dr. Thompson. She arrived on a Saturday afternoon looking older and more serious than I remembered. The bubbly young teacher I'd once hoped would become my daughter-in-law had been replaced by someone who carried herself with hard-won wisdom about addiction and its effects on families. "First," she said as we sat on my front porch with glasses of iced tea, "I want you to know that I think you did the right thing by pressing charges against Marcus. When I first heard about it, I thought it was harsh. But the more I learn about addiction and enabling, the more I understand that you probably saved his life by refusing to sell your house." That wasn't what I'd expected to hear. "What do you mean?" "In Al-Anon, we talk a lot about hitting bottom. The idea that addicts often have to lose everything before they're motivated to get help. If you had sold your house and paid his debts, Marcus would have learned that there was literally nothing he could do that would cost him your support. He would have kept gambling, kept accumulating debts, kept escalating his behavior until something much worse happened." Jennifer paused to sip her tea, then continued. "But when you called the police on him, when you pressed charges, when you got a restraining order, you showed him that actions have consequences, even with the people who love him most. Maybe for the first time in his adult life, he couldn't manipulate or guilt trip his way out of trouble." "I still feel guilty about it sometimes," I admitted. "He's my son. I'm supposed to protect him." "That's exactly what you did," Jennifer said firmly. "You protected him from his own addiction by refusing to enable it further. That's the hardest kind of love there is. The kind that says no when someone you care about is asking for something that will ultimately harm them." We talked for 2 hours, sharing stories about Marcus's gambling and its effect on our lives. Jennifer told me about the lies he'd told her, the money he'd stolen from her purse, the nights she'd waited up wondering if he was safe, or if he'd gambled away their rent money again. "I kept thinking I could love him enough to make him stop," she said. "I kept believing that if I was just more understanding, more supportive, more patient, he'd realize what he was throwing away and choose to get help. But it doesn't work that way, does it? No, it doesn't. Love can't cure addiction. Treatment and personal commitment can cure addiction, but only if the person with the addiction wants to change more than they want to keep using." As Jennifer was preparing to leave, she handed me a pamphlet about Al-Anon meetings in our area. "You might find it helpful," she said. "Being around other people who've been through similar experiences can be really healing, and it might help you prepare for when Marcus gets out of jail and starts trying to rebuild his life." After she left, I sat on my porch reading the pamphlet as the sun set behind the oak tree that Robert had planted 38 years ago. The tree had grown strong and tall, its roots deep and its branches wide, providing shade and beauty and a home for countless birds over the years. Maybe that was the kind of foundation I'd tried to provide for Marcus, deep roots and steady support that would help him grow into the man he was meant to be. But somewhere along the way, my nurturing had become smothering, my protection had become enabling, and my love had become a barrier to his growth instead of a catalyst for it. Chapter 19. Facing the Future. Marcus was released from jail in September after serving his full 6-month sentence. I knew because the Victim Services Coordinator called to inform me, as required by law, he would be entering a residential treatment program immediately, followed by 2 years of supervised probation. I'd been dreading this moment for weeks. As long as Marcus was incarcerated, I knew where he was and that he was safe. I also knew that he couldn't contact me or show up at my house unexpectedly. His release meant returning to uncertainty about his whereabouts and intentions. Dr. Thompson and I had spent several sessions preparing for this transition, discussing my boundaries and expectations for any future contact with Marcus. "Remember," she told me during our last session before his release, "you have the right to control the terms of any relationship you might choose to rebuild with your son. You can take as much time as you need, require whatever evidence of change you think is necessary, and maintain whatever boundaries feel safe for you. What if he shows up at my house? Then you call the police immediately. The restraining order is still in effect, and violating it would be a serious offense that could land him back in jail." I'd also prepared practically for his release. I'd changed my phone number, installed new locks on all the doors and windows, and set up a security system that would alert me if anyone approached my property. These measures felt extreme, but they also provided peace of mind that allowed me to sleep better at night. 2 weeks after Marcus's release, I received another letter from him. This one was mailed from the residential treatment facility where he was living. "Dear Mama, I know I'm not supposed to contact you because of the restraining order, but my counselor said I could write letters as part of my recovery work, as long as I don't ask you to respond or try to pressure you into contact. I've been in residential treatment for 2 weeks now, and it's the hardest thing I've ever done. Not physically, though the structure and rules take some getting used to, but emotionally. We spend hours every day talking about the damage our addictions have caused, not just to ourselves, but to the people we love. I've told my counselor and my group about what I did to you, about hitting you and demanding that you sell your house to pay my debts. Writing those words makes me feel sick, but I'm learning that I have to face the truth about my behavior if I want to change. Everyone here keeps talking about making amends, about apologizing to the people we've hurt and trying to repair the damage we've caused. But my counselor has helped me understand that true amends aren't just about saying sorry, they're about changing the behavior that caused the hurt in the first place. I can't undo what I did to you. I can't take back the violence or the lies or the years of manipulation and financial abuse. But I can commit to becoming a different person, the kind of person who would never put his own mother in danger or ask her to sacrifice her home for his mistakes. I don't know if you'll ever be able to forgive me or trust me again. I don't know if we'll ever have a relationship that isn't haunted by what I did, but I want you to know that I'm finally doing the work of getting better. Not because I think it will, more understanding about his desperation. Maybe if I'd offered to mortgage the house instead of selling it outright. Maybe if I'd been a better mother from the beginning, none of this would have happened. But then I looked around my kitchen, at the table where Robert and I had shared thousands of meals. At the window where I'd watched Marcus play in the backyard as a child, at the refrigerator covered with his school pictures and report cards and Little League certificates, and I knew I'd made the right choice. This house wasn't just my home, it was my history, my identity, my connection to everyone I'd ever loved. Selling it wouldn't save Marcus from his addiction. It would only enable him to gamble away even more money while destroying the last stable thing in both our lives. At 2:17 a.m., I finally picked up the phone and dialed 911. 911, what's your emergency? I'd like to report a domestic violence incident. The words felt strange coming out of my mouth. Domestic violence was something that happened to other people, younger people. People who didn't have the wisdom that was supposed to come with age and experience. It wasn't something that happened to retired nurses living quietly in houses they'd owned for 47 years. Ma'am, are you in immediate danger? No, the perpetrator has left the scene. Can you tell me what happened? I took a deep breath and told the dispatcher everything. About Marcus's gambling addiction, about the money he owed to dangerous people, about his demand that I sell my house to pay his debts, and about the moment when love turned to violence in my own kitchen. The dispatcher was professional, but kind, asking the right questions without making me feel judged or foolish. She told me an officer would be there within 20 minutes to take a full report, and she advised me to take photos of my injuries and gather any documentation I had about Marcus's gambling debts. While I waited for the police, I called my sister Ruth in Atlanta. She was 3 years younger than me, but had always been the practical one in the family, the one who saw situations clearly without the emotional fog that sometimes clouded my judgment. Dorothy, it's after 2 a.m. What's wrong? I told her the whole story from the beginning right up to the phone call I'd just made. Ruth listened without interruption, making only small sounds of sympathy and understanding. When I finished, there was a long silence. Dorothy, honey, I am so sorry, but I want you to know that you did the right thing. Did I? Because right now, it feels like I just destroyed my family. You didn't destroy anything, sweetie. Marcus did that when he chose gambling over his responsibilities. You didn't destroy it when you chose to protect yourself instead of enabling his addiction. But he's my son, Ruth. He's all I have left of Robert. No, he's not. Her voice was firm but loving. Marcus is his own person, responsible for his own choices. Robert was a good man who worked hard and loved his family. Marcus is a grown man who has made some very bad decisions and is now facing the consequences. They're not the same person, Dorothy, and you can't keep treating them like they are. The doorbell rang as she was speaking. Through the window, I could see the red and blue lights of a police cruiser parked at my curb. The police are here, I told Ruth. Good. Talk to them, file the report, and then get some sleep. We'll figure out the rest tomorrow. What if I never see him again? What if this is how it ends between us? Then that's his choice, not yours. You can't love someone into being healthy, Dorothy. You can't sacrifice yourself to save someone who doesn't want to be saved.